of Singapore. You can see now a motorcade slowly making its way from the premises and making that short drive over to the Istana, which is just about 5 kilometers away.
All right, Teresa, is that the infamous beast there?
That is also known as Cadillac One. That is the official vehicle that ferries President Trump around wherever he travels. It arrived here separately yesterday.
On a cargo plane, I've heard. That plane flies all these cars in. Do we have any idea in which car Mr. Trump might be situated?
One of the vehicles with the American flags at the bonnet of the vehicle, likely carrying President Trump. And as with the scene yesterday, we can see media, definitely some onlookers lining the streets, watching the spectacle.
It's heading closer to the Astana now. I think Istana on the other side of the road, where the official schedule has Mr. Trump arriving at the Istana Palace at 12 noon, where he will have a one-on-one bilateral meeting with Singapore Prime Minister Mr. Lee Hsien Loong. At 12:30, he will have an expanded bilateral meeting followed by a working lunch, again with Prime Minister Lee. All this, Teresa, he will leave, it should all wrap up by 2:05, leaving Istana Palace then.
We have correspondents on the ground who will bring you the latest as they unfold. Again, if you're just joining us, here are live pictures in downtown Singapore of President Donald Trump's convoy heading from the Shangri-La Hotel to the Istana. About a 15-minute drive away, and you can see clearly the roads are free and open for the convoy to make its way over.
All right, we've just seen the back end of the convoy there. Are we almost at, what time is it, right? 3 minutes to its official arrival at the Istana for Mr. Trump. No, 11:50, 12 noon. All right, what you are seeing right now is, in fact, we've just seen the motorcade drive by. Is Mr. Trump leaving with his special car? It's known as the Beast, a Cadillac, traveling from his hotel in Singapore. That's the Shangri-La Hotel, headed for the Istana Palace, where he will be meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister for first a bilateral meeting and then an expanded bilateral meeting followed by a working lunch. Because Mr. Trump is here for the summit, we're all talking about it, due tomorrow at Capella in Sentosa Island. But yesterday, his counterpart, or rather Korean leader Kim Jong-Un, met Mr. Lee. After he arrived in the afternoon, he met Mr. Lee after that, and today it is Mr. Trump's turn.
Exactly. So no official agenda for Chairman Kim Jong-un today, but we do know, as you said, President Trump meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in the Istana. And a few facts about the Beast, Wei Su, that you mentioned, that vehicle ferrying Mr. Trump
bulletproof
around.
And bomb-proof.
15 million US dollars as well.
Apparently, there's a decoy that travels with it as well. Okay, we're looking at pictures outside the Istana. Of course, what we just saw was Mr. Trump's motorcade traveling past. He had left Shangri-La Hotel. He'd been staying, headed into Istana Palace. The Istana Palace is the official residence and office of Singapore's president. But of course, today, Mr. Trump is meeting Singapore's Prime Minister, that's Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, at the Istana for several things. A meeting, a bilateral meeting, an expanded bilateral meeting, followed by a working lunch. And then all this should wrap up by 2:05 this afternoon. He will then leave and arrive back at his hotel at Shangri-La Hotel. And 2:20, he will meet and greet members of the U.S. Embassy. But now you can see outside the Istana, he's probably inside right now. We will, of course, have footage and reports of that the moment we do get it.
High security presence, of course. The tab pegged at $20 million. That's about 15 million US dollars. Most of that going to security. And as the same as yesterday, there are a number of onlookers observing this.
Not just a number, Teresa, because the U.S. entourage has it's much clearer what they're doing, so people can line up and wait for them. Yesterday, where people wearing T-shirts and waving slogans saying "Make America Great." And that's, of course, Mr. Trump's very personal, private message to everyone. This is compared to the North Korean entourage, of which very little is known. All we know is they flew in their own chefs, all their private services, so we're not certain what's really going on. It's very hard to catch a glimpse of Mr. Kim because we don't know where he is. We certainly do not know what he's doing today.
And what we've seen in the past with the North Korean leader is we'd hear reports about a visit after the fact, which again lends itself to a bit of difficulty for the media covering his activities. And where our camera is situated, so the view that you're looking at now is on one side of the road where much of the world's media is assembled. Some estimate up to 3,000 members of the media from around the world here for this summit.
Okay, our correspondent Simon Marks is standing by for us outside the Istana. Let's see if we can get hold of it, Simon.
Absolutely, Wei Su. There's a bit of an eerie silence, I have to say, on the streets outside the Astana here. That's partly, of course, because the roads have been closed, so there's no traffic rumbling past the entrance to the building, but also several hundred onlookers, as you can see, gathered behind barricades, hoping to catch a glimpse of Donald Trump in that car, the Beast, as it heads into this meeting with Singapore Prime Minister Lee and a series of conversations that will culminate, as you mentioned, with that working lunch. Certainly no shortage of issues for them to discuss. Prime among them, of course, the agenda for the summit meeting with Kim Jong-Un and President Trump's mood and atmospheric thoughts about that meeting. And we're now seeing the beginning of the White House convoy arrive here. For those of us who live in Washington, D.C., this is a very familiar sight, but it's obviously not such a familiar sight on the streets of Singapore. The White House communications vehicle there in the front, bristling with antennas that keep the president connected. And there goes Donald Trump's motorcade now, the president of the United States waving to onlookers as he speeds into the Astana for his meeting with PM Lee. And that's quite a sight, isn't it, to see that entourage of cars flown in from the United States, rumbling through the streets of Singapore and heading into the Astana through its gates there.
You're right, son. We keep talking about the historic summit, but I think the sense of historic has only just hit me looking at all those clearly American cars trundling their way down a famous, familiar Singapore road.
Now, Simon, President Trump is expected to be at the Astana for about 2 hours. Can you tell us what we know about the agenda between President Trump and Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong?
Yeah, it's worth saying he's taking a lot of people with him. You see all those white vans there. We've seen several vans carrying White House staff, and I think at least 2, possibly 3 white vans carrying members of the traveling White House press corps that are always accompanying President Trump when he heads into meetings like this. Look, over the last few hours, there's been some definite posturing on the part of some of President Trump's top aides as they prepare for the summit meeting with Kim Jong-Un, notably Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is almost certainly with President Trump at the Astana for these meetings and this lunch. He took to Twitter to say that the United States is absolutely determined to try and seek the complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament of North Korea's nuclear capabilities. And that is definitely, I think, an attempt by Mike Pompeo to try and concentrate the minds of North Korea, certainly ahead of the meeting with Kim Jong-Un, but perhaps also an attempt by Mike Pompeo to try and concentrate President Trump's mind. The President of the United States spent a good part of this morning tweeting about the issue of world trade, and again expressing anger and antipathy towards the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, with whom he had quite a bust-up after that G7 summit in Canada. He's only tweeted once about being in Singapore, saying that that it's great to be here and he can feel excitement in the air. I mean, there is a sense that the sands on which this summit has been built have slightly shifted in the last few weeks, with President Trump now indicating that he'll settle for a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue with Kim Jong-Un, but not necessarily a deep and abiding commitment by the North Koreans to denuclearize. Well, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, just within the last couple of hours has underscored that that is the goal of this summit meeting, whether the North Koreans and indeed whether President Donald Trump fully realize it.
Simon, Wei Su here. It's interesting you bring that up. If Mike Pompeo is saying the U.S. is determined to seek CVID, Mr. Trump has spent the last 1-2 weeks gently backpedaling on that. Is this disunity on the Washington front or just disunity on the tweeting front?
Well, I think it may be an attempt to try and secure focus, Wei. So, I mean, look, there's no question that when this summit was first being mooted, and let's remember, that's not all that long ago in the great sweep of human history. I mean, we only actually knew this summit was happening about 5 weeks ago. But when it was first mooted, President Trump said he would only meet with the man that he used to refer to as Little Rocket Man, Kim Jong-Un, if he could secure a verifiable deal on the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. As time has marched on, it's become apparent that the North Koreans aren't necessarily fully ready to engage in that kind of conversation, but that Donald Trump feels that it is still worth meeting Kim Jong-un in order to prod that dialogue forward. And we've had indications that perhaps the United States would settle for a peace treaty to end the Korean War, or would agree to establish diplomatic relations with North Korea, or at least begin that process, culminating with the opening of an embassy in Pyongyang at some point in the future. That is clear mission creep versus what we were hearing from President Trump when the summit was first being discussed. So when Mike Pompeo takes to Twitter and says, look, this really is all about CVID, the complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, that may be an attempt as much to concentrate minds within Donald Trump's inner circle as it is to remind the North Koreans of precisely why everybody has come here.
Now, Simon, for the viewers who are just joining us now, we are looking at live pictures outside the Istana, which in Malay means palace, and President Donald Trump, his entourage have entered the premises just moments ago ahead of a one-on-one bilateral meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And as they made their way, the roads were clear because this was designated a special zone for this event. And so traffic was only reopened moments ago after the motorcade made its way to the Istana. Now, Simon, President Trump, it seems, is trying to make this summit about himself in some ways. You know, when we saw him arrive on Air Force One last night, it was Mr. Trump himself who came down those stairs, and National Security Advisor John Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, they came out of the aircraft from another entrance. So how much of this summit do you think is about Mr. Trump himself?
Teresa, everything about the Donald Trump presidency is about Donald Trump, and particularly this meeting due to take place tomorrow on Sentosa with Kim Jong-un. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. There are cooler heads in the White House who thought that this summit would not happen, particularly after President Trump said it was off. And I think that there was a sense of relief on the part of some within Donald Trump's inner circle who privately would concede that this has been put together very, very rapidly and without the degree of preparation, choreography and calibration that one normally sees for a big international summit meeting like this. But it was Donald Trump's force of personality, ultimately, that put this thing back on the table. It was Donald Trump's force of personality plus more conciliatory language from North Korea that allowed him to say to those members of his inner circle who at one point point publicly were saying, you know, 10 days away from the summit is no period of time whatsoever in order to put something together like this. He was able to say to them, well, look, I think it's important for us to do this and it's important for us to move ahead. And as he prepares to meet the Singapore PM Lee for these talks at the Istana, you know, he's got a vote of thanks to offer to Singapore for rolling with those punches, because everybody here thought the summit would happen, then suddenly they thought it was off, and then suddenly it was back on again. And so there must have been a sense of some dislocation here as Donald Trump, as he conceded, played games with the date of the summit and the likelihood of it actually occurring. So perhaps during the course of this lunch, he will express a vote of thanks to PM Lee and the entire Singaporean administration for having really rolled with all of those punches.
Simon, Wei Su here again. Just a quick reminder to our audience what you are seeing. Pictures, live pictures outside the Istana, and we're heading inside the Istana. Let's take a look. Now, Mr. Trump, now it's inside the Istana. That's, of course, the official residence and office of Singapore's president. Mr. Trump arrived there about 2 to 3 minutes ago. He should be meeting Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, in about 10 minutes. And you can see the reporters, huge amount of reporters, media presence, Teresa.
Exactly. So they do have to register if they were at the International Media Center where our colleagues are. And we know about 2,500 to up to 3,000 members of the media are in Singapore covering this summit. A number of them assembling themselves there, waiting for President Trump to
She's holding
enter.
up a paper for white balance for the camera crew. We should be very familiar with it.
So this is a technical aspect of the job where they're just making sure the color is
balanced.
Actually,
I've never quite understood white balance. Have you? We just hold up a piece of paper. All right, the white paper essentially is the correct color when you film on site.
Correct.
All right, we're waiting for Mr. Trump to arrive. Officially, his meeting with Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, that's Singapore's Prime Minister, starts in 8 minutes and 30 seconds. He has arrived because we saw the car enter the Astana several minutes ago.
Now, yesterday, Kim Jong-Un had his own one-on-one meeting with Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, and that took place a couple of hours after he landed here in Singapore. As for Mr. Kim, today, there is no official agenda for his activities. So we do have our crew members out throughout Singapore. If we do catch a glimpse of Chairman
Teresa, we are being reminded to talk about the room behind, but honestly, I have no idea what that room is, and I'm not going to guess anything about that. Yeah. Okay, it could be a dining table because they are having a working lunch, but we cannot be absolutely sure about that. In any case, there's a bilateral meeting first, and then an expanded bilateral meeting followed by this working lunch, which may be conducted in that room behind the glass doors. All right, the journalists, as you mentioned, Teresa, did you say 2,500 to 3,000? Mm-hmm. And that, according to Singapore's Prime Minister, is a very big reason why we have a $20 million bill that we now need to settle for this huge summit event, which Singapore is very pleased to settle because this is our way of giving back to world peace.
So that's about $15 million US. And if you think about it, Singapore has only had a couple of weeks to prepare for this
2 weeks,
summit.
Mr. Lee said.
Okay, 2 weeks. And they've done quite a fantastic job. They have cordoned off special event areas around the hotels where Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump are staying. They are ensuring the safe and smooth passage of these two men wherever they need to be on the island as well.
Simon, sorry for taking so much time away from you to take a look at these pictures. Let's return to what you just said. Well, you didn't just say that. I had a question which I now forget. Teresa, do you have anything to follow up with Simon right now? No, all right, I remember. You were saying, we were talking about the very hurried diplomatic efforts ahead of this summit. But I would counter that by saying, given that it would take years to sort out denuclearization, the details of that, the technical details of that, and come to that, even the lifting of sanctions. That's a lot of work. That's years and years of work. Why not have a summit first and then deal with the details later, seeing as we can't have that many years to deal with the details anyway?
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think that there's no question about it. You're not going to agree over one brief meeting in Singapore, the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And perhaps when President Trump said initially, look, that's the qualification for the meeting, that was in and of itself too high a bar, and the White House may have appreciated that. But look, there is still a big and vigorous discussion underway back in Washington about whether the mere notion of a meeting between these two men, President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-Un, bestows on the North Koreans respectability, bestows a sense that the United States accepts that Kim Jong-Un is the justifiable ruler of North Korea, something, of course, that previous US presidents have been very loath to do. And there is a worry among critics of the Trump administration that Kim Jong-Un returns to Singapore, returns to North Korea from Singapore, able to say to his own people, look, they want to deal with me. They understand that I'm the man who runs things around here. And that's quite a give by the United States to him. It's also worth making the point, Wei Su, that the mere fact that President Trump is having a longer meeting with PM Lee, the mere fact that he's having lunch with the PM, which is something that did not take place yesterday with Kim Jong-un, that in and of itself conveys something to the North Koreans. It suggests to them that, you know, when you are truly accepted, then you have the expanded bilateral meeting, you have the full lunch, you have the big discussion. Whereas Kim Jong-un's presence here at the Astana yesterday, important and symbolic though it was clearly a lower level kind of appearance than Donald Trump's.
It is now 12:05 in the afternoon here in Singapore. President Donald Trump expected to meet with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in just a few minutes. And if you're just joining us, these are live pictures of the Istana, or the palace in Malay. This is the official office and official residence of the President of Singapore. And this is where Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong will meet President Trump and a number of assembled journalists from around the world at this location. And what's interesting is Kim Jong-un has also brought with him his own state media. And one of our reporters, actually, they were out on location, and there was one North Korean media person who came out to take some video, and immediately they were swarmed because they're a bit of a spectacle in themselves. And so
the famous three North Korean journalists.
I'm not sure if it was one of them, but it was a videographer from North Korea here to capture this historic event.
What were people interested in asking?
That's a good question. Not that he could speak English, I'm guessing, but I think the sense that a North Korean was on the streets here in Singapore sparks a lot of curiosity amongst people in Singapore. So again, we are just waiting for President Donald Trump to make his appearance here at the Istana, and members of the international press assembling themselves for that moment.
All right, just a quick little bit of information that's just come in. This morning, of course, other diplomatic efforts going on. For example, where was this? Was the Ritz-Carlton, where the American ambassador to the Philippines, Mr. Sung Kim, was meeting with North Korean officials. Now, we've just been told Cho Soon-hui, that's the North Korean negotiator, has returned to St. Regis. That's, of course, where the North Korean entourage is staying after holding that meeting with the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines. Mr. Sung Kim is leading preparations for this summit. He's also served in the capacity as a former nuclear negotiator with Pyongyang. That's why he's here to help Mr. Trump out. We haven't heard a great deal about what happened in that discussion at the Ritz-Carlton earlier this morning. But our colleague Jeremy was on site, and he gave us what little he knew at that point. I think it's closed door, was it not, Therese?
I believe it was, yes. We will connect with Jeremy later on in the bulletin as well to see what more he has gleaned from that event.
All right, we're in the Istana right now. Any moment now, a minute and a half on the official schedule to the meeting of Mr. Trump with Singapore Prime Minister Mr. Lee Hsien Loong.
Now, if you're just joining us here on Channel News Asia, we are just moments away from U.S. President Donald Trump entering the Istana in the heart of Singapore. Now, for those of you not familiar with Singapore, the Istana is the official residence and office of the president of the country, and this is where Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong will be receiving President Donald Trump.
Because we were asking our correspondent Simon Marks earlier on what we expected Mr. Trump and Mr. Lee to be talking about. Not a lot has happened. Of course, we're coming straight off a very fractious G7 summit. All right, coming off that summit, so worries about if Washington can treat its allies like this, what's going to happen here in Singapore? Oh, Teresa, what's the schedule for Mr. Trump this afternoon?
So on his agenda at 12:10, so a few moments from now, he will participate in a one-on-one bilateral meeting with Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, and that will extend to a working lunch with the Prime Minister of Singapore. And this afternoon, Mr. Donald Trump will also be meeting with the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. So a quite busy schedule. And surely Kim Jong-Un also very busy today, although we don't know what he's up to exactly.
In fact, our correspondent Yun Sok was outside his hotel and didn't see much movement. So apparently he's having a lie-in.
Now, our correspondent Simon Marks is just outside the Istana. Thank you for your patience, Simon. Let's bring you back into this. Now, we have an idea of the agenda from the North Korean perspective for this summit. And, you know, they say their top priority is establishing new DPRK-U.S. relations. If you look at that list, Simon, denuclearization is third on that list. So what does that tell you?
Yeah, and that's fascinating because, of course, the United States would want denuclearization to top the list. And the establishment of ties between the United States and the DPRK would naturally follow on from denuclearization as opposed to being the dominant issue on the list. Now, it's perfectly possible that they will be able to find a way of talking about both of those things and perhaps issue some kind of statement at the end of the summit that tells us that they've managed to make some progress on both of those issues. As to what can be discussed between Donald Trump and the PM in the working meeting and then over lunch, I mean, you know, as you know, Singapore is viewed in Washington, D.C. As the quintessentially honest broker. There aren't many things that unite President Trump's administration with the administrations of all of his predecessors, but it is that idea that Singapore is a completely honest broker and manages to have a very, very clear and direct line of communication with successive U.S. presidents, now including Donald Trump. That is something that the PM, I think, can really take advantage of over the course of the next hour or so. And one of the issues that may come up is this sense among governments throughout the region that they want to be certain that Donald Trump is as committed to protecting their populations from North Korea's short-range nuclear capabilities as he is committed to worrying about North Korea's long-range nuclear capabilities and its capacity to strike at what's known back in the United States as the American homeland, because there is some nervousness about that. Is Donald Trump truly coming here to benefit the entire region and to safeguard the entire region? Or is his primary focus, as it invariably is, on making America great again, and in this case, making America safe again? And there will be anxiety over whether the North Koreans might seek to drive a wedge between long-range and short-range nuclear capabilities in their conversations with the President of the United States.
If I could
that's one thing that may come up during conversations.
To be fair, Simon, I would not expect the American president to put someone else's interest above the interest of America. Is it possible that Mr. Trump might be able to balance both American interests and the interests of its allies like South Korea and Japan?
Well, I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? I mean, Donald Trump, he's made it absolutely apparent time and time again. His paramount concern is always what takes place in the United States, particularly with regard, for example, to those conversations about trade where he has been willing within the last, 36 hours to shred relationships that the United States has traditionally enjoyed with close allies like Canada and several countries in Europe. But on the other hand, there is a very, very important balance to strike in this particular region, given treaty obligations that the United States has to allies like South Korea, given the closeness of relationships and ties between the government of Donald Trump and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Japan, and also, of course, given China's growing influence in the region and its desire to exert continually growing influence all over the region. So it's perfectly possible for the American president to make sure that no one gets left behind, but I think governments throughout the region will want to be certain that Donald Trump is committed to that and isn't simply coming here and viewing all of this through the prism of the American homeland.
Now, for our viewers just joining us here on Channel News Asia, let's get you up to speed with what you are looking at. We are positioned right now inside the Istana, which is the official office and residence of the President of Singapore. This is where President Trump will be received by Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And if you look just beyond those doors, as we are focusing here, you can see a dining table. And that is where they will be having their
Teresa,
working lunch
we've
as
just
well.
heard Mr. Trump and Mr. Lee are having a private meeting right now. If you could look at, just count the chairs there. There's at least, how many do you see, Teresa? That will include the U.S. delegation. Of course, right up until this point, we haven't had precise details about who exactly is. All right, this room is called the banquet hall. We're not very sure who makes up the U.S. delegation. Teresa, you mentioned just now that coming off the plane, you saw Mike Pompeo, that's the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and who else did you see?
John Bolton as well.
On that list, there's been touted about in various media sources that possibly Chief of Staff John Kelly and Deputy Chief of Staff Joe Hagan might be on that list, but absolutely no details on that right now. But we will see who makes up the U.S. delegation when they arrive for their working lunch. As you can see beyond there, the glasses on the table, the goblets, the laid out napkins and that, Teresa.
Many more details to emerge, including, interestingly, what is going to be on the menu of this working lunch. You know, I spoke to some people in the food and beverage industry here saying there's so much meaning that can be conveyed in a meal, right? So we know President Donald Trump likes American beef. Will that be served? What kind of North Korean dishes could possibly be served? Or will it be neutral? Will they be serving chili crab or some other Singaporean delicacy? Those interesting details to emerge as well.
Well, given that Mr. Kim brought with him an entire troupe of chefs and private cooking materials and food substances, I wonder whether he can actually have a meal with any other delegation. Right. Okay, why it matters on who is on the U.S. delegation. Just a few days ago, we were all reading on the news, all this alarm, is John Bolton in the delegation or is he not? And that matters because John Bolton is a self-professed, famous North Korean hawk. Very, very harsh, and he's returned to service in the White House. And if he's on this team, it suggests the tone of the team might be a bit harder than otherwise.
Although when Air Force One arrived in Singapore, it was President Trump who walked down those steps.
Oh, he will always take the spotlight.
Front and center, exactly.
The issues over John Bolton was because just a few weeks ago he made a comment about the Libya model possibly being applied to North Korea, and that really sent off alarm bells in Pyongyang. No one likes to imagine their end as the rather brutal end that Muammar Gaddafi, that's the Libyan leader, met several years ago. And North Korea really took offense at that and wanted to call off the meeting. Mr. Trump then called it off, and then, well, we're here right now, right? One day to this historic summit.
Well, there were accusations as well from the Trump administration that China was possibly meddling in this arrangement, saying, you know, after Beijing met with Pyongyang, for some reason, Kim Jong-Un was not as open to meeting with the US president.
I think we'd be very naive if we imagined nothing went on when Xi Jinping met Kim Jong-un. I don't think they meet for nothing. Something must have happened. Your guess is, Teresa.
Well, there are so many stakeholders in this, right? It's definitely not just the United States and North Korea. There is China, of course, South Korea, Japan, Russia, all watching what is going to happen over the next 24, 48 hours.
All right. Okay, we cut away from here right now. Let's cross to our correspondent, Jeremy Ko. Now, Jeremy was outside Ritz-Carlton earlier, where there was a discussion being held between the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, that is Mr. Sung Kim, along with North Korean officials, presumably to bang out more details ahead of the summit tomorrow. Jeremy, when we crossed you earlier, there was relatively little detail of what had happened. Have you heard any more since then?
Well, it's still the same. There was a mad scramble here just a couple of minutes ago when the top North Korean negotiator Cho Sung-hui, the Vice Foreign Minister of North Korea, left this venue about 2 hours after the meeting started at 10 a.m. Today. And shortly after that, Sung Kim, the U.S. ambassador, he's the top Korean affairs expert from the State Department, he also left this venue. We tried asking them questions. We shouted questions at the two of them, but they remained tight-lipped. Ms. Cho was impassive. She just walked out of this venue surrounded by her bodyguards. So presumably we're back at where we were earlier today. They were here presumably to iron out details of tomorrow's summit between U.S. President Donald Trump as well as North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un. Now, vast differences remain between the two sides over what denuclearization means. On the U.S. side, they're talking about CVID, that's complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantling of nuclear weapons in North Korea. And on the North Korean side, they're talking about denuclearization on the entire Korean peninsula. Now, that would involve the removal of almost 29,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. And it will also involve the removal of the U.S. nuclear umbrella that covers South Korea as well as Japan. So vast differences remain between the two sides. We don't know whether this last-minute negotiations have resulted in any results, but we'll know tomorrow.
But Jeremy, we may not have known the substance of the talks, but you saw the people who went in and came out. You mentioned Ms. Choi Sun-hui. KCNA this morning suggested that the vice chairman of the Central Committee of the WPK, Mr. Kim Yong-chol and Ri Soo-yong, as well as No Kwang-chol, the Minister of the People's Armed Forces, are in the North Korean delegation. Did you see any of these people walking towards this meeting or leaving the meeting?
None of them were spotted here, as far as I know, but it's only led by Cho Sung-hui. Of course, Ms. Cho as well as Mr. Sung have met several times since the Inter-Korean Summit held in Panmunjom. They've held several working-level talks to iron out the differences ahead of tomorrow's Trump-Kim Summit. They'll also be meeting to discuss the security arrangements as well as other arrangements ahead of tomorrow's summit. As we know, tomorrow's summit is very significant because what we're hearing is there could be a peace treaty to end the Korean War. As we know, the Korean War in the 1950 to 1953 ended not in a peace treaty, but it ended in an armistice. That means that the two Koreas are still technically at war. And if a declaration to end the Korean War is announced tomorrow, that will indeed be very significant, not only for the Koreans on the Korean Peninsula, but also for Northeast Asia as well as the world.
Jeremy, do you mean a peace treaty or just an agreement to have a peace treaty? An actual treaty being signed tomorrow?
Well, they could be talking about agreement. Well, that remains to be seen, but what we're expecting right now is an agreement to end the peace treaty, agreement to end the Korean War, and also an agreement about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. But experts say that even though U.S. President Donald Trump says that denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula could take place in a short time, but experts believe that could take as long as 10 years or even longer, because it's not just about dismantling the facilities. There's also about the question about cost. Who's going to foot the bill for North Korea to dismantle all its nuclear facilities, as well as to verify the dismantling of these facilities? So many questions down the road. So it's going to be a bumpy road ahead. And it's not going to be settled tomorrow. Tomorrow, what we're likely to see is a declaration to end the Korean War, perhaps.
All right, thank you very much. That is Jeremy Ko reporting live from the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Now, for those of you just joining us here on Channel News Asia, let's situate you now. So our camera is set up inside the Istana, which is the official home and office of the president of the country. And this is where President Donald Trump and Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong will be meeting for a lunch quite shortly. They are currently in a private one-on-one meeting before we are expecting them to come out, possibly address the assembled media there. And you can see beyond those doors, there is a table set up for that lunch. There are plates and flower arrangement down the center of that as well. Now, watching this with us is our correspondent, Simon Marks, who is just outside the Istana. Simon, I want to talk again about President Trump's state right now in terms of coming off that G7 meeting in Quebec, Canada, where he made a bit of an about-face. And looking at the Canadian media, you know, they are saying that when they saw President Trump's tweets that they were so out of step with those private G7 meetings, they actually thought that those were from a parody account. And then they realized that was actually the real Donald Trump. So give us a sense of what you think is going through President Trump's mind as he's here in Singapore. Do you think there are lingering thoughts from that G7 summit?
You know, Teresa, that's always the question Washington correspondents now, I think, most fear, which is what's going through Donald Trump's mind. I mean, it is so difficult to know. What we can say is that the Canadians have been absolutely taken aback, not just by Donald Trump's tweets aboard Air Force One and his decision to pull out of that G7 final communique that he had previously agreed to sign off on, but also by the comments that some of his top aides back in Washington have been making over the last few hours, including Peter Navarro, very familiar to the Chinese, one of President Trump's trade negotiators, who has said that there is a special place in hell reserved for the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for his decision to stab Donald Trump in the back at the G7 meeting. I mean, that is just astonishing language for any American official to be making about Canada. I mean, a country that barely ever causes a ripple in U.S. relationships. So there's no question that President Trump has indicated that even established alliances with countries like Canada, countries like Germany, France and Britain can be shredded if and when he feels that it is politically expedient so to do. But those officials back in Washington have also said that it was the timing of what they perceive as Justin Trudeau's betrayal that so irritated the president, because he felt it was sending a message to North Korea, and what he wanted to signal to North Korea was that he was absolutely determined to be strong in the summit with Kim Jong-Un tomorrow here in Singapore, and that he wasn't going to tolerate any weakness and wasn't going to tolerate any backsliding, even on the part of allies like Canada. So it was really, they now say, the timing of what they say was Justin Trudeau's betrayal that so absolutely infuriated Donald Trump and led to that extraordinary outburst on board Air Force One. Where is his head today? Well, this morning he was still tweeting about the G7, about NATO, about trade relationships, and saying that it doesn't matter if you're a friend or foe of the United States. He, Donald Trump, is always going to put the interests of the American worker first. There will be those watching who wonder how he's got time to be tweeting about those issues when they would argue he should be absolutely hunkered down and preparing for the meeting with Kim Jong-Un in order to make no unforced errors during his one-on-one meeting with the North Korean leader.
Exactly, Simon. I'm looking at President Trump's Twitter account right now, and the last tweet was made 2 hours ago, commenting on the trade spat with the Canadians. So exactly, his headspace at that time was still not around this summit. Now, again, the pictures that our viewers are seeing on the screen right now, if you're just joining us, this is inside the Istana, which is where President Donald Trump and Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, will be greeting the media momentarily. They are currently in a one-on-one private meeting with each other. And just beyond those doors, that is where the working lunch will be taking place. And we now understand that there are 24 seats at that table, 12 on each side.
Does that suggest 12 from each party, as in 12 from the United States, 12 from Singapore? We'll find out. It doesn't matter who makes up the U.S. delegation, because I suppose the composition of the delegation will determine both the direction and how hard the United States might press on issues such as denuclearization, a peace treaty, matters like that, which might stymie a deal. Oh, it's crossed to our correspondent Jeremy Cole. Jeremy was standing by for us earlier, reporting on an event at Ritz-Carlton Hotel between America's ambassador to the Philippines, Mr. Sung Kim, and a North Korean delegation to talk about details for this summit. Jeremy mentioned that Ms. Cho Son-hui, the North Korean negotiator, was in that meeting and he did not notice anyone else. She left that meeting at 12:06 this afternoon. That's about 22 minutes ago. Jeremy, any other updates since then?
Well, we still don't know whether they will return after lunch to continue the negotiations. But reporters here, some are still waiting, but the bulk of them have left. So what happened earlier today was at about 9:30 a.m. local time. First, Song Kim, the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, he's also the top Korean affairs expert. He arrived here at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel to enter the meeting. And about 15 minutes later, Cho Song-hui, she's the Vice Foreign Minister of North Korea, she arrived here. And the meeting was due to start at 10 a.m. No details about the meeting whatsoever, but we're expecting that they're meeting, last-minute meeting to discuss what happens tomorrow and also to hammer out details of what denuclearization exactly means. As we know, the U.S. as well as the North Korean side have differing interpretations of what denuclearization means. On the Korean side, they're talking about denuclearization on the entire Korean peninsula. That would involve removing the nuclear umbrella that the U.S. currently provides to South Korea and Japan. And on the U.S. side, they're talking about the denuclearization, the complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantling of nuclear facilities of North Korea. So certainly, different words they're using, so different interpretations as well. But we don't know what came out because both sides remained tight-lipped after they emerged from the meeting about 2 hours after it started, and both were driven off in their cars.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. That was Jeremy Ko, our colleague, recapping this morning's event at the Ritz-Carlton for us. No details because it was closed door, but it was a meeting between America's ambassador to the Philippines, Mr. Song Kim, himself a former nuclear negotiator, and North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister, Ms. Cho Son-hui. If we have details from that, we will certainly return to you with them. Right now, Teresa, we are looking at pictures from the Istana Palace in Singapore, where Mr. Trump probably is concluding his meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, right now. After they finish this meeting, they will head into that dining room beyond the glass doors that you can see. 12:30, you get an expanded bilateral meeting and a working lunch. What we can see beyond those doors are 24 chairs. Am I right, Teresa? Presumably half and half, although that may not be strictly so. They will have a lunch, and that will all end at 2:05.
And again, if you're wondering why we have been on this shot for about half an hour now, I've actually received a tweet from a viewer asking us, why can't you show us when President Trump actually stepped out of his vehicle? Why can't we see more? And frankly, we are showing you as much as we are able to. Sometimes we are restricted by logistics. Sometimes we are limited by protocol. So we are bringing you as much as we can from the Istana.
I would like to see Mr. Trump exiting his car, but
everybody's waiting for the man.
I have no access to it any more than anyone else.
All right, Simon Marks is standing by patiently. Let's bring him back into this now. Simon, so you're outside the Astana. It looks like business as usual, cars passing by. I'm curious to know your thoughts on a personal level, because you have followed President Trump throughout his tenure. You have followed American politics. How do you feel being in Singapore reporting on this meeting?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. I mean, I didn't think it was going to happen. I assumed when President Trump cancelled the summit, my trip to Singapore was cancelled along with it, and then suddenly the whole thing was back on, and here we are witnessing what is by any measure an absolutely astonishing moment in the history of the US presidency. Donald Trump doing what no other American president has done, coming face to face with a North Korean leader. When we see the makeup of the American delegation inside that banqueting room, keep an eye on any body language that exists. First of all, keep an eye on whether John Bolton is actually in the room, the national security advisor, but also keep an eye on body language between John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. You were saying a few minutes ago that, John Bolton had infuriated the North Koreans by referring to the Libyan model of disarmament, which of course ultimately led to the death of Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader in Libya. But John Bolton also infuriated the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and there are credible reports, multiple credible reports in Washington Washington that the two of them had a stand-up row in the White House after John Bolton made those comments, and that the relationship between them is somewhat strained. Remember, from a North Korean perspective, John Bolton is no stranger. He's a real foreign policy hawk in the United States, and he actually wrote the book, literally wrote the book, on how the United States could conduct a preemptive military strike against North Korea. That was before he was brought into government by President Donald Trump. So it's going to be very interesting to see what role John Bolton plays here in Singapore, not just here at the Astana, but also in those conversations that take place tomorrow on Sentosa. The other thing that will be interesting to learn is, what do they serve for lunch? I know you've been sort of speculating about whether there might be some Singaporean delicacies on the table. The way to Donald Trump's heart, I have to tell you, is through some pretty plain food. There's nothing he likes more than a well-done steak, a wedge salad, and to top it all off, a chocolate brownie. I'm not sure that the Singapore PM is definitely necessarily going to go that route, but that's the kind of thing Donald Trump likes to tuck into.
You know, Simon, I was at the Shangri-La a couple of weeks ago on another story, and I was speaking to the executive chef there, asking him, you know, if the summit takes place here, if President Trump or Mr. Kim Jong-Un are in your hotel, do you know what you're going to be doing? And he said, frankly, no, not yet, but I'm sure they have come up with a delicious menu for the two men.
Yes, we have. I was looking at packages of gold flecked burgers. Sorry, Simon. Do continue.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, like many journalists here in Singapore to cover this summit, I'm a bit of a foodie, and there's nothing I like more than, when I'm not standing in front of the camera, going to explore the various restaurants and eateries here in Singapore. Chefs will tell you that Donald Trump doesn't just like his steak well done, he likes it absolutely, completely well done. And there are chefs that are so appalled by this notion back in the United States, they've actually voiced opposition to the way in which Donald Trump likes his steak. The only place that he gets his steak the way he wants it in Washington, D.C., outside the White House, of course, where he's got a personal chef, is at the Trump Hotel, right round the corner from the White House, and he dines there on a pretty regular basis.
And one final note on the cuisine for this summit. Some 2,500 media personnel have registered at the International Media Center, which is at the Formula One pit stop area. And according to reports, media are being served chicken rice and laksa, other Singaporean delicacies. And also apparently there was kimchi ice cream that I've seen some reporters tweet about. So food definitely on the minds of many here. Thank you, Simon. Please stand by. We will connect with you shortly. Another correspondent who is out on the grounds in Singapore for us this afternoon is Yun-Suk. She's a familiar face to us here on the network, normally in Seoul, but we have brought her here to Singapore. And I believe she's just outside the St. Regis Hotel, which is where Chairman Kim Jong-un is staying for the duration of his visit here. Yun-Suk, what are things like where you are?
Well, right now it is very quiet. We really don't know what Chairman Kim Jong-un is doing inside that hotel. We do know that he is in there. We've seen some kind of movements with the North Korean officials going in and out. And a while ago, we were hearing that the person, Choi Sun-hee, who was involved in those discussions with Mr. Kim Song-kim from the United States, had just come back. We have had no briefings. She didn't make any comments. And so we don't really know exactly what was discussed between the two of them. But these are two people, you know, who've met many times before. They were in South Korea last week, in fact, at the Truth Village of Panmunjom, holding several rounds of meetings and very likely trying to get the very details of that historic summit between the two leaders tomorrow. Very likely that they were fine-tuning the final details of everything with only just one day to go. But there is some movement here, although it is very quiet when it comes to North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. We really don't know what he's going to be doing today, but many experts are saying that very likely he is getting ready for that historic summit, something that he has been preparing for and waiting for all this time.
Thank you for that, Yun-Suk. Yun-Suk, of course, studying for out at St. Regis, where Mr. Kim is staying now. Movement as well at the Istana, where Mr. Trump is meeting PM Lee Hsien Loong. And we're hearing movement as well in the Astana. They are supposed to start the expanded bilateral meeting at 12:30. That was 8 minutes ago, moving into a working lunch. That could be happening right now, Teresa.
We're expecting both gentlemen to appear in front of our cameras at any moment now. Now, if you're wondering why President Donald Trump arrived in Singapore without his wife, Melania, it's actually because she is recovering from surgery to treat a benign kidney condition. And doctors have ordered her to stay in the White House. And that is why President Trump has traveled here alone, although he did express last week Melania's wish to travel to the G7 summit in Quebec, Canada, as well as to Singapore with Mr. Trump. But unfortunately, due to medical reasons, she has been unable to.
All right, you're looking at pictures of the Istana, the dining room, presumably where the working lunch will be held. 24 chairs there, suggesting a 12-member delegation from the United States. But that, of course, awaits confirmation. We're all waiting with bated breath to see who is on that delegation. All right, in fact, we do have that guest list for us that has been...
Now, we are learning about Mr. Trump's delegation, and they include Mr. Matthew Pottinger. He's the Senior Director for Asian Affairs of the U.S. National Security Council. Also, Ms. Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, White House Press Secretary. Of course, we know Mr. John Bolton is in Singapore. He is the U.S. National Security Advisor. Also part of Mr. Trump's delegation is Mr. John Kelly. He's White House Chief of Staff. Mr. Stephen Miller, Senior Advisor to the President for Policy. We have Ms. Mira Ricardel. She's the Deputy National Security Advisor.
Just a quick reminder, these names that Teresa has, they do not necessarily mean that this is the entire delegation, but this is the delegation that is having the working lunch with Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. There may be many more on that delegation of which we're unaware, but this is the 12-member team that will be meeting Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong this afternoon for an expanded bilateral meeting, followed by a working lunch.
Exactly, and we caught a glimpse of them in a way as we saw President Trump's motorcade enter the Istana. We saw a number of white vehicles following Cadillac One, or the Beast, which carries President Trump. And Simon Marks, our correspondent, pointed out that those vehicles carried out Mr. Trump's aides and other members of the administration.
Any names on that list stand out for you, Teresa?
Well, I guess Mr. John Bolton, of course, right? Because there were so many questions around his role in all of this. Had there been a falling out, or because he has been so prominent in terms of dealing with North Korea, that he would be quite a strong member to have on his team. And he is indeed here in Singapore.
And of course, as Simon mentioned earlier, it's not just Mr. Bolton not getting along too well with the North Koreans. Apparently, a great deal of friction between Mr. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Mr. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Apparently, a lot of friction between the two. So how they are going to unite alongside Mr. Trump to face down or face up to a North Korean delegation, we will only find out tomorrow. Are you looking at pictures of the Istana, where shortly we expect Mr. Donald Trump, the U.S. president, to be having an expanded bilateral meeting followed by working lunch with Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong. Accompanying Mr. Trump, 11 other people to make up a 12-member U.S. delegation for that working lunch. It all should all wrap up at 2:05, assuming they are not running over schedule. We were actually supposed to start this expanded meeting and working lunch at 12:30 so that we can wrap by 2:05. If things are being conducted punctually, we will finish at 2:05, after which Mr. Trump will leave Astana and head back to his hotel, the Shangri-La. 2:15 he arrives. We're looking at the delegation. Take a look right now. All right, you're looking at, that must be the Singapore delegation. Pardon us for the silence. We were trying to get the names right for anyone that we can recognize headed into that lunch. I saw Mr. S. Iswaran from the Prime Minister's office, and that is Vivian Balakrishnan, our Foreign Minister. Did you see anyone else, Teresa?
Now, the doors finally open to the banquet hall where this 24-member lunch will be taking place shortly. We have yet to see President Donald Trump or Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, but we do expect to catch them in front of our cameras at any moment. So do stay with us here on Channel News Asia. Now, for those of you who are not watching our coverage yesterday, our cameras were also at the Istana because Chairman Kim Jong-Un paid a visit to Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. But a very different affair. Mr. Kim was at the Astana for about half an hour. There was a photo opportunity. A few words were exchanged. Mr. Kim thanking Prime Minister Lee for Singapore's role in all of this, because really only a couple of weeks for this island to really prepare for such a historic day, or a few days rather. And they have done so quite well. They've managed to get the security personnel in place. They've managed to secure the various locations throughout the island that will be holding the summit and hosting these leaders as well. So again, Mr. Kim's visit with Mr. Lee Hsien Loong yesterday was only about half an hour long before he retired to his hotel, the St. Regis, in the heart of Singapore. Today, though, President Trump spending a bit more time at the Istana. About 2 hours, we are told.
We just mentioned the Singapore delegation that just headed into that dining room right now, the dining room that has 24 chairs laid out, presumably half for the Singapore side, half for the US side. I was busy writing names down, so I missed some of the faces. We saw Mr. S. Iswaran, Minister of Communications and Information, and also Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, and other dignitaries, Singaporean officials. Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. And let's take a look. There's more movement happening right now. Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and US President Donald Trump finally arriving for their working lunch.
Big job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. President, many of America's allies are ready to start training you.
All right, just a very brief greeting there from the US President and Singapore's Prime Minister as they get down to work at their working lunch.
Let's bring in our correspondent Simon Marks, who is just outside the Istana. Simon, so the assembled media there waiting patiently for about an hour, and we have seen now Mr. Trump greet the media very briefly. What do you make of this? Did you expect Mr. Trump to say a bit more, or is this an indication that Mr. Trump is trying to keep his cards close to his chest?
Look, I mean, there was never any indication on the president's schedule, and the White House publicizes his schedule ahead of time, that he and the Singapore Prime Minister were going to make any remarks at the Astana. You heard American correspondents who are traveling with him. They're members of the traveling White House press pool. They come from newspapers like the New York Times, the broadcast networks in the United States. You could hear them shouting questions at Donald Trump and not getting an answer to them, but perhaps we'll get some more color when the pool
Simon, sorry, we're going to stop you there
reports,
right now. We are going to take a moment to look at these live pictures of the banquet room where the 24 individuals have assembled for this working lunch. President Donald Trump to the left of your screen there in the center. Let's listen in.
Mr. President, many of America's allies are ready to Thank you. Let's go. Thank you.
All right, the press being gently removed from the room so that the working lunch can get on in earnest. As we saw very briefly there, Mr. Trump, and to his right we had Mike Pompeo, the National Secretary of State, and to his right Mr. John Bolton, and to his right Ms. Sarah Huckabee Sanders. We don't have any more details on that right now. We cross to Simon. Simon, you can see. Well, as you mentioned, in this delegation, we've got both Mike Pompeo and John Bolton sitting alongside Mr. Trump. What do you think this portends for tomorrow's meeting?
Yeah, the seating arrangements are interesting, aren't they? To Donald Trump's immediate left, you had the White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who has just marked 1 year in office, and a very turbulent year it's been for him. But to the president's immediate right, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, then John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, then Sarah Huckabee Sanders, of course, the White House Press Secretary, who's always attending events like this because she needs to know what went on in order to brief reporters. You heard some members of the White House press corps there, as they always do, trying to shout questions at President Trump. I think especially when he's visiting a foreign head of government's palace like the Astana, President Trump's not going to take the bait and isn't going to engage in a back and forth with those White House correspondents. And so he kept his counsel there, and the press were escorted out of the room. Does it convey anything, the fact that Mike Pompeo is sitting to his immediate right and John Bolton is to that Pompeo?
I mean, that pardon me for cutting in, Simon. We are looking at pictures coming out of Ritz-Carlton right now, where there was a meeting between American ambassador to the Philippines, Mr. Sung Kim, and North Korean officials, Vice Foreign Minister Ms. Cho Son-hui. I think that's Mr. Sung Kim right now. Is that so, Teresa?
Correct. Yes, he's entering a vehicle. We're not sure where he is.
There's a very rushed, hurried exit there. So unlikely to have got any response from him about any outcomes on that meeting with Ms. Cho Son-hui. That's North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister. This is, of course, outside the Hotel Ritz-Carlton. Apologies, Simon, for cutting you off like that. If we could return to you. You said very interesting seating arrangements. How likely, given the sorts of tweets we're seeing, are these officials, are they able to stay professional in dealing with each other when they are tweeting insults at each other as well? Oh.
You know, look, I mean, the Trump administration has been more turbulent than any of its predecessors in terms of staff turnover. We've never seen the degree of staff turnover in the West Wing of the White House that Donald Trump has endured. Remember, Mike Pompeo was only just appointed Secretary of State, succeeding Rex Tillerson, whose own personal relationship with Donald Trump absolutely was shattered after it was publicly disclosed that Rex Tillerson had referred to Donald Trump as a moron, something that Rex Tillerson has never denied publicly that he actually said. John Bolton himself is Donald Trump's third national security advisor in just the, year and a half since Donald Trump became President of the United States. General John Kelly, as I say, has just marked 1 year as President Trump's Chief of Staff, and there are very few people in Washington who think that it is likely that he will end up marking a second anniversary in that position. So this has been a very turbulent time for everybody who has signed on voluntarily to work for the most quixotic president that I think we've ever seen, but a real political maverick, a man who ripped up the rule book of American politics, first to win the Republican Party's presidential nomination, then to win the keys to the White House itself, and now rips up the rule book of international relations. And as a result of that maverick spirit, which of course attracts so many of his core supporters across the United States, finds himself here in Singapore making history.
Well, Simon, as you mentioned, ripping up the rulebook, maybe this pugnacious style of dealing with colleagues and adversaries and allies may be the right way to deal with a man who, let's face it, kills his senior officials with anti-aircraft guns, purges his own uncle, his own half-brother. There must be a way to do this that cannot follow a rulebook.
Yeah, but I think, Wei Su, you're raising an issue that is of concern, particularly to the foreign policy elites back in Washington, D.C., the sort of the formers, the people who used to be Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. They populate the think tanks in Washington, D.C., both Democrats and Republicans, and they worry that what's getting lost in the pomp and ceremony that we've witnessed on the streets of Singapore just in the last 24 hours or so, and we'll witness again tomorrow when these two men meet on Sentosa is the fact that Kim Jong-Un has such a brutal record in power, and previous presidents have not agreed to meet, not just with Kim Jong-un, but with his father and his grandfather, because they felt that absent some sort of commitment to a change in North Korean behavior, they were essentially bestowing on the North Korean government a sense of legitimacy by the United States. And the worry that those former foreign policy officials have back in Washington, D.C. is that when this is all over, if Donald Trump doesn't come back with something absolutely concrete, he will have given away that sense of legitimacy and allowed Kim Jong-un to return to the country where he rules from a very repressive administration. And he will be able to say to the North Korean people, see, after all is said and done, I am the person that Donald Trump wants to deal with. I'm the person on the international stage that governments overseas now recognize as the legitimate ruler of North Korea. That's going to be a very, very careful needle that Donald Trump is going to have to thread.
All right, Simon Marks, thank you so much. You're reporting just outside the Astana. Please stand by. About 3 kilometers away from where you are is our correspondent Yim Yun-suk, and she's just outside the St. Regis Hotel where Mr. Kim Jong-un is staying. So Yun-suk, we now have a very clear idea of who comprises the U.S. delegation. Can you tell us more about who has accompanied Mr. Kim Jong-un to Singapore?
Well, yes, I am outside the St. Regis Hotel where Chairman Kim Jong-un is thought of to be in there since he was in there since yesterday. And together with him, who flew from all the way from Pyongyang, is his sister, Kim Yo-jong. She's in one of those delegates. Also, we saw Kim Young-chol, and he's the person who flew all the way to Washington with that letter, carrying that letter for the U.S. President Donald Trump. And he is here too, and he really played a crucial role in getting this whole summit together. Also, we hear that the defense minister here is here too. And so he did bring all of his close aides, people that he trusts, and people who were involved from the very beginning in putting together, making preparations for all of this. We heard about the Choi Son-hee, and she has been involved in the discussions with Song Kim from the U.S. and detailing the agenda and going through every little details of that, so the two leaders will be able to go together for the historic summit on Tuesday and hopefully be able to come out with some kind of a successful deal. And so lots of preparations being done from the North Korean side.
But Yun-suk, very, very quickly, with the U.S. delegation, we are seeing questions about if you've got so-and-so on the delegation, you're more likely to get a sudden thrust in consultations tomorrow. With North Korean officials, do we have that same sense of, can we predict what's going to happen based on who is in the delegation?
Well, it is those people that I've just mentioned. I mean, the fact that the Kim Yo-jong is there, she's been out there in the spotlight since Chairman Kim said that he was going to open up, and he did, sending his sister and other delegates to South Korea. But also the fact that the defense minister is there, it says that he does want to start talking about possibly the hostilities on the Korean Peninsula, and very likely to try and replace that armistice that was signed between the U.S., North Korea, China in 1953. And so he is here, and especially with the military person, also in military uniform, to show that North Korea is this military state, is in power. And so he does have his delegates, and they will all be meeting with the U.S. President Donald Trump. And although we are hearing that there is going to be this one-to-one discussions, time where the two leaders will be allowed to be on their own, as we've seen Chairman Kim Jong-un do it with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in when they were holding their first ever Inter-Korea summit. And so it looks like that same sort of scene, except we don't know where or how they're going to do it, but they will have this personal sort of like dialogue just between the two leaders. They'll have their translators, except I think that is the time when the both of them will try to see if they can reach some kind of a deal, because they do know that all eyes are on here. And even the North Korea state media has said that they know that this is a historic meeting. The North Korea state media has even mentioned it in North Korea's newspapers. And so this is something that I think Kim Jong-un knows, that even North Korea is watching, with the whole world watching. They do want the successful hosting of this, and hopefully some kind of a deal can be reached, but we'll only know after that historic summit on Tuesday.
Well, thanks for that, Yun-suk. Stay with us. More news, much more news on Channel News Asia. A very good Monday afternoon to you. I'm Lo Kwei Su.
I'm Teresa Tang. It was on, then it was off. Now it is very much on again. Just 6 months ago, such a meeting would have been unimaginable.
But today we are on the cusp of an historic event. It's a day to go to that summit between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un.
And I'm Adam Bakhtiar, counting down to that much-anticipated meeting in around about 20 hours from now. And we have a big lineup in our special coverage for you today. Well, over the next few days, be sure to follow our team of reporters as we bring you continuous coverage of this historic summit.
Simon Marks, our U.S. bureau chief, is here with us in Singapore. He will be tracking what U.S. President Donald Trump wants to accomplish and what he could offer during these negotiations, which are taking place after weeks of rocky and hurried diplomacy.
Our Korea correspondent Yim Yun-suk is here in Singapore to shed light on the high stakes for Seoul, which has played a key role in trying to facilitate an official end to the Korean War.
And also joining us from Singapore, John Leong, Dawn Tan and Jeremy Ko.
Julie Yu is in Seoul talking to South Koreans and the business community there. What are they expecting from these talks?
Olivia Seong joins us from Tantong City on China's border with North Korea. China is North Korea's most influential ally. Come to that, it's its only ally and its biggest trading partner.
And Michio Ishida is in Tokyo as Japan seeks to keep itself in view during talks between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un.
Here are our top stories. US President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong have met at the Istana.
Diplomatic efforts continue ahead of this much-anticipated meeting on Tuesday. US and North Korean officials held working-level talks this morning in Singapore.
Well, a recap of our top story this hour. U.S. President Donald Trump has met with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong at the Istana. Both of them met for a private meeting and lunch.
Earlier, Mr. Trump left the Shangri-La Hotel where he's staying with his entourage. Separately, U.S. and North Korean officials held working-level talks this morning at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Singapore, ahead, of course, of the much-anticipated meeting on Tuesday.
The meeting is aimed at narrowing differences before their leaders hold the summit tomorrow. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in a tweet that Washington was committed to the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. U.S. officials say the summit could be a one-on-one with just the interpreters present.
Mr. Trump started the day with a series of angry tweets lashing out at allies Canada and Europe. He also thanked Singapore for the beautiful welcome and tweeted that it's great to be in Singapore and that there's excitement in the air.
Let's head to the Istana, where Mr. Trump is having a meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong. Our correspondent Simon Marks is stationed just outside the Istana. He's been monitoring developments with us throughout the morning and afternoon, and he joins us now. So, Simon, Mr. Trump was clearly not completely focused on the summit meeting earlier. You know, looking at his tweet trail earlier, he was tweeting about the G7 summit still. Do you think this lunch and bilateral meeting with Mr. Lee will possibly focus Mr. Trump a bit?
Well, certainly going to focus the President of the United States, at least for the immediate period that he's inside the Astana there behind me. It's been about an hour since the presidential limousine, the Beast, accompanied by a long cavalcade of other vehicles, made its way through those gates behind me. And as you know, President Trump and the Singapore Prime Minister are now at lunch with their aides and top lieutenants discussing a variety of issues, but we believe paramount among them, of course, this summit meeting that will be taking place tomorrow on Sentosa with Kim Jong-un. The sands of time are expiring. The clock is ticking. Decisions have to be made about precisely what the United States is going to be seeking from North Korea, just as decisions have to be made about what North Korea will want to hear from the United States. And so there is a real need on the part of President Trump to focus on the immediate issue at hand, which is that meeting with Kim Jong-un Jong-Un at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I think there was a bit of a sense of an alarm when President Trump stirred at the Shangri-La Hotel a few hours ago, and as he does every day, immediately turned to Twitter and wasn't tweeting about the upcoming meeting with Kim Jong-Un, but instead was continuing to fire shots at the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and European allies whom he believes wronged the United States at the G7 summit in Canada over the weekend. There's a big opportunity here at the Astana for the Singapore Prime Minister to try and help change that conversation, focus President Trump's mind and get him ready for what is undoubtedly going to be a meeting that goes down in the history books, and a meeting that requires calmness and a sense of absolute focus before Donald Trump walks into that room.
Well, Simon, earlier you were talking about the preferred diet of Mr. Trump, steak, salad. I think Mr. Lee is known for being rather more abstemious. Given the difference in their characters, do you think Mr. Lee will be able to exercise that calming, focusing influence on Mr. Trump ahead of this very important summit?
Well, you know, so you can argue that that's exactly what the Singaporeans have been doing in Washington for decades, exercising a calming influence over successive presidents of the United States. And the PM comes into this lunch a known quantity and a valued quantity in Donald Trump's White House. They've met on several occasions in the past, and of course since President Trump assumed occupancy in the Oval Office. And the United States really owes Singapore an enormous debt of thanks, not just for the work that's been done over the last couple of weeks to get this summit arranged, and the arrangements, I think, by any international standards of summitry have been absolutely up to the mark and beyond it, but also for rolling with the punches, because, of course, preparations were underway, and then suddenly President Trump wrote that letter to Kim Jong-Un saying the summit's off, you've engaged in hostile comments towards the United States and towards some of his top aides, including Vice President Mike Pence. So there was a great deal of uncertainty about whether this would actually take place. Singapore occupies a unique place within the White House of Donald Trump and within the White House more generally. And just as Singapore has done in the past, there's an opportunity, I think, for the PM to say, in the nicest possible way, look, President Trump, this stuff is about to get real.
Now, Simon, of course, we're all really focused on that summit between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim tomorrow. But I presume Mr. Trump and Mr. Lee might have other issues they want to talk about. For example, just a week and so ago, the Shangri-La dialogue was held here. I heard the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, deliver a very clear, unequivocal message on disputes in the South China Sea. Now, these are the rumbling matters. Are we likely to hear any of this right now at this working lunch?
Well, I think it's highly likely that they're talking about it. Whether they'll be very much press attention to what they say on those particular issues, the South China Sea, the US relationship with ASEAN. Is Donald Trump going to follow in Barack Obama's footsteps and accentuate the relationship between the United States and ASEAN, or is that going to return to taking more of a backseat in terms of US international policy making? Those issues will, I think, unquestionably be on the table, as will a discussion about the regional impact of what President Trump and Kim Jong-Un will be doing tomorrow. I mean, inevitably, the minds of the reporters gathered here at the Istana, the thousands of reporters gathered here in Singapore, I think will be to focus inexorably on the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-Un. But you're absolutely right. You can't remove that from the broader context of the bilateral conversations that take place between the United States and Singapore on a continuing basis, and the broader regional security concerns that really do find themselves focused in conversations about the South China Sea specifically and about China's rise more generally.
All right, Simon Marks, stand by. Thank you so much for that. Reporting live just outside the Istana, the official residence and office of the President of Singapore. Now, we're going to take you about 8 minutes to the west of where Simon is, to the St. Regis Hotel. That is where our correspondent Yim Suk is standing by, just outside of where Mr. Kim Jong-un is staying for the duration of his trip. So Yun Suk, you know, it's hard to imagine anybody on the planet, really, not getting information about this summit because the eyes of the world are trained on Singapore, on what's transpiring every moment here. But you think about North Korea. How much do we know in terms of what the people of North Korea are learning about these few days?
Well, I don't think the North Koreans are learning what we are learning right now. I don't think they know anything about this Donald Trump's meeting with the Singapore Prime Minister. But what we do know is that the North Koreans do know that their leader, Kim Jong-Un, is here in Singapore. It wasn't reported on Sunday when he left Pyongyang, the South North Korean capital, but it was reported early this morning. And in fact, North Korea's media has released about 3 different statements on this, about his departure, about his meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister on Sunday evening. And a little bit more details coming out about that historic summit meeting on Tuesday. And in fact, the North Korea state media was saying that this is a historic summit, calling it that. And it had details about what it wanted out of it, saying that denuclearization issues will be discussed, talking about having this permanent and peacekeeping mechanism on place, and also about mutual concerns, issues that will concern both parties will be discussed. And so the North Koreans, I think, know that the leader is here and those issues are going to be discussed. But what, all the very details of what exactly is going on here today, we'll have to wait and see whether the North Koreans will be learning about that historic summit meeting on Tuesday, on the day that it happens.
Yoon-Suk, I was reading this news you mentioned through reports on state media KCNA, and it's the English version. There's a link there that says read original version at source. I clicked it and it really doesn't work. So I was wondering, I'm reading one version in English. The Korean version, would that read differently for the Korean people?
Well, I think it has the same message. There is the same message that was written out in English and then also in Korean. But if you look at even the English version, if you look at it really carefully, there is a line that says, in line with the changes going ahead, in line with the changes of the era, the time, and that is important. In line with those changes, this is what we're going to do. And then the North Korea's media details what I just said about what will be discussed. And I think that thing telling North Koreans that there is changes going ahead around this world, and perhaps he is bracing the North Koreans for possible changes that could be taking place after this meeting on Tuesday. But experts are saying that it is interesting that he is talking about changes and he is bringing out this because we have been hearing from various officials who've been meeting with Washington and Pyongyang, and even the Singapore foreign minister saying that he does think that North Korea, together with the United States, but especially North Korea, is sincere about this whole historic summit and is sincere about carrying out this denuclearization. Although, denuclearization issue is, depending on who you talk to, whether you talk to North Koreans or people from the U.S., it may differ, but North Korea is here to talk about denuclearization. They're hoping that they'll be able to get some kind of peace regime going. But it seems like the North Koreans are here, and at least for now, they are sincere about sitting down, having this face-to-face one meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump, and hopefully something good will come out of that.
Yoon-Suk, we're reading about these reports now, but as of late Sunday, yesterday, it was a bit of a running joke on some forums that the last we heard of Kim Jong-un is he was visiting a seafood restaurant on Saturday. So complete media blackout on this visit, and suddenly 3 reports come Monday morning. Am I overreading messages into this, or is this worth commenting?
Well, it is the state media, and the fact that the state media, KCNA, had reported on his departure from Pyongyang and about him coming here in these 3 separate releases, it was a surprise to me, too. I did not expect North Koreans to learn about it, but possibly after the historic summit. But so that is a surprise, and, looking at the state media, really talking about the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, visiting the seafood restaurant, those are the information that we really get from North North Korea state media. And a lot of it is the propaganda materials. And so we sort of like tend to overlook what comes out in the North Korean state media, and including that he went to the seafood. And it's the way that the North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un can sort of like brace himself and let the North Koreans know what he's doing for the North Koreans to help the North Korea's economy and the efforts that he is putting into that. And that is a message for the North Koreans, which is out in the North Korean media. And so this thing about him leaving North Korea, which really hasn't been done before. This is the first time that he has left North Korea, apart from going to countries like China. This is the longest that he has traveled outside of North Korea, apart from the fact that he was in Switzerland when he was young. And so telling them stuff like that, I think is important for the North Korean people too.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Yoon Suk. That was Lim Yoon Suk speaking to us live from the St. Regis Hotel. The meeting between U.S. ambassadors to the Philippines, Sung Kim, and a North Korean delegation has ended. Mr. Sung Kim is leading preparations for the Trump-Kim summit. He also served in the capacity as a former nuclear negotiator with Pyongyang.
Our correspondent Jeremy Ko joins us live from the Ritz-Carlton Hotel with more on that meeting. Jeremy, a short time ago, we saw a flurry of activity. Can you recap what has happened over the last half hour or so?
Yes, certainly a flurry of activity here over the last few hours. But like most things to do with the Trump-Kim summit, everything was conducted in extreme secrecy. Now, first of all, Ambassador Sung Kim arrived at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel at about 9:30 a.m. local time. After that, the North Korean Vice Foreign Minister Cho Sung-hui arrived here about 15 minutes later, and the meeting started at about 10 a.m. local time. And about 12 noon, that's about 2 hours after the meeting started, Ms. Cho left this hotel. She was surrounded by a swarm of reporters who surrounded her, but she remained impassive and she didn't respond to any of the questions that reporters shouted at her. Similarly for Sung Kim, when he exited this hotel some 15 minutes later after Ms. Cho, the same situation happened. Reporters surrounded him and his car, but nothing was mentioned. But it's probably safe to assume that the two negotiators were talking about what's to do with the Trump-Kim summit that's happening tomorrow. They're ironing some last-minute details, for instance, what the interpretation of denuclearization, what that means, because the U.S. side as well as the North Korean side have different interpretations of what this term means. On the U.S. side, denuclearization remains to the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. And on the North Korean side, it's talking about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, that involves the removal of the nuclear umbrella around by the U.S. over South Korea and Japan, and it also might also involve the removal of the some 29,000 U.S. troops from South Korea as well. But we must not forget that even though the talks here are between U.S. and North Korea, there's also China that's looming in the background. As we know, China is a very important partner to these talks, and it's also the sole major ally to North Korea as well. As we know, China has a long, porous border with North Korea, and it's been propping up the North's economy over the last few years. So for any denuclearization, for any term for any resolution to this situation, China will have to be involved.
That's right. So many people, so many countries invested in what happens at this summit. Thank you so much. Our correspondent Jeremy Ko there, just outside the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in the heart of Singapore.
U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un arrived on Sunday for this summit here in Singapore. And how did this summit get to Singapore? Adam Bakhtiar tells us more.
Well, you know, Wesu and Teresa, there have been a lot of twists and turns for this summit to actually happen. Who would have thought taunts and threats would turn into talks? Who would have thought rhetorical warfare would wind up in a summit? Well, the landmark meeting was inconceivable even a fortnight ago. Now, here's a timeline of the events that has led to this historic summit here in Singapore. Now, the first meeting between a sitting U.S. president and North Korean leader. Well, Kim Jong-un set things in motion with his New Year's address. See how he ditched the dark tones and went for a grey suit. A state-run South Korean think tank said that it reflected a softer image. Now, that day, Mr. Kim made a surprise offer for talks with Seoul. He was also open to North Korea's taking part in Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. But even as he made this peace offer to the South, he also had a warning for the U.S. Mr. Kim declared there was a nuclear button on his desk. Well, Donald Trump laughed off the threat, and he said his nuclear button was bigger and more powerful, and it worked. Now, while the two leaders traded barbs, the South Korea took up the North's offer, and the first formal inter-Korean talks in more than 2 years were held at the border truce village of Panmunjom, and the North offered to send its team to the Pyeongchang Games in February. Well, in March, South Korean National Security Advisor, who was in Washington at the time, said that Mr. Kim was willing to meet Mr. Trump. Now, Mr. Trump formally accepted the invitation 2 days later. The White House set a timeline for the end of May. Well, big progress was to be made in April, with Mr. Kim stepping across the Korean border for a historic summit with President Moon Jae-in. And all this time, speculation building on where the Trump-Kim summit would take place. The South Korean media said Singapore and Mongolia were shortlisted. Now, the big reveal came on Twitter. Mr. Trump said that he would meet Mr. Kim in Singapore on the 12th of June. As a goodwill gesture, Pyongyang said it would dismantle its nuclear test site and invite foreign journalists to attend. Journalists were busy making other bookings, too, for the Trump-Kim summit here in Singapore. Then came the first dampener. North Korea's reaction to an interview that dated back to April. Mr. Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, called for the North to follow the Libya model for denuclearization. That model eventually led to the death of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. He was killed by rebels 8 years after renouncing nuclear weapons. Well, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence also warned that the North could end up like Libya. The North Korean Vice Foreign Minister dismissed Mr. Pence's remarks as stupid. She said the North would not beg for dialogue. Now, with talks appearing to be on shaky ground, South Korean President Moon Jae-in swung into damage control mode. He headed to Washington and he met up with Donald Trump. But 2 days later, Mr. Trump called off the summit, then lobbed the ball in North Korea's court. His letter to Mr. Kim: please do not hesitate to call or write if you change your mind. Now, some political observers said it was a staged walkout by a master negotiator. Mr. Moon and Mr. Kim held an impromptu 2-hour meeting in the DMZ to salvage the summit. In a televised address, Mr. Moon reiterated the North's commitment to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and also to sit down with Mr. Trump. Now, the U.S. president then reversed his stance and said June 12th hadn't changed. Since then, we have seen a flurry of diplomatic activity to make this summit happen here in Singapore. We're off for a quick break. Still to come, more on one of the most complicated topic of discussions during the Trump-Kim summit, denuclearization. Stay tuned.
U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister of Singapore Lee Hsien Loong have met at the Istana, a day ahead of a historic summit between Mr. Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un.
Well, diplomatic efforts continue ahead of the much-anticipated meeting. U.S. and North Korean officials set to hold, or they have held, working-level talks this morning in Singapore.
And we're bringing you the latest trading action here in Asia as the South Korean markets start trading.
Well, checking in on the markets here in Asia as we kick off a fresh trading week here. And we've been up and running for quite a few hours. The picture is looking rather mixed. I mean, investors have one eye, of course, on the trade tensions following the G7 summit. That turned a little bit fractious since Donald Trump's tweets this morning on that very issue. But the other eye closely watching, of course, the events at the summit underway here in Singapore and the big day happening, obviously, tomorrow. We're going to start off with the South Korean market, the Kospi moving higher throughout the trading session here. Investor sentiment getting emboldened by hope that there will be thawing of relations on the Korean Peninsula and also between North Korea and the U.S. According to the brokers, they say that sectors that are leading the charge in Seoul today are really coming from construction and engineering. All those shares are rallying quite heavily, put together with the tech shares as well. The Korean won is on the back foot versus the U.S. dollar, but that has very little to do with, of course, the summit underway currently. The U.S. dollar had been broadly stronger in risk aversion following, of course, the outcome of the G7 summit. Now, earlier, I spoke with AJ Carling about let's kick off with the Japanese market there. We've got, by the way, about half an hour to go before both these stock markets close for the trading session. There doesn't appear to be much move in the Nikkei today. All the focus, obviously, on South Korea's Kospi. Earlier on today, I spoke with AJ Carling, Senior Manager, Trade Education and Operations at TD Ameritrade. He tells us how the Trump-Kim summit would impact global markets, depending on the outcome.
Exciting time here in Singapore. We need to be prepared for the fact that this meeting might last 5 minutes and it might be 5 hours. We don't know exactly what's going to come of this. There are probably two resolutions. Either the goal of denuclearization is achieved or at least beginning conversations for that. That, I think, will have immediate impacts here on the Asian markets. You've been talking about it already, South Korea, China, and Japan. These are countries that have been living almost, in fear of what's going to happen next. So if there's at least some progression about those talks, the immediate markets in those regions are going to definitely benefit. Now, of course, this meeting is going to happen 9 p.m. New York time, so U.S. markets will be closed, but our customers at TD Ameritrade Singapore will be definitely watching the futures markets. Of course, the traditional safe havens like gold and bonds, U.S. Treasuries, you can never count out. Those things will be very active depending on what kind of outcome happens tomorrow morning.
Well, moving away from the summit, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad says that growing nations like his country need different trade protections and that trade pacts such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TPP must be renegotiated. Now, Dr. Mahathir made the comments during his official visit to Japan, his first trip abroad after becoming Malaysia's 7th Prime Minister last month. Now, Dr. Mahathir has called for a review of the TPP last week. And at an international seminar in Tokyo today, he reasserted that stance. Now, he says different economies need different rules in order to compete fairly with giants such as the US and China, although he did say that Malaysia was not totally against the pact, but the terms have to be worked out again. Now, Mr. Mahathir said the ideal would be a broad trade pact such as the East Asian Economic Caucus he proposed during his previous administration, and that such a pact would be useful to counter China's growing economic might in the region. Now, Dr. Mahathir's visit is also being seen as a sign of Malaysia's move away from China. His 3-day visit, he will also be discussing with Mr. Abe the Look East policy, as well as investments from Japan. Now, Dr. Mahathir also spoke on the prospects of his political future.
Already I am the oldest Prime Minister in the world. So that will be a record if I reach 95 and still remain Prime Minister. But serving the country is all I care for. And if that is what people want me to do, I will accede to their wishes. Okay.
Well, stay with us on our continuous breaking news coverage of the historic Trump-Kim summit here in Singapore, only on Channel News Asia.
Donald Trump and Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong have met at the Istana, a day ahead of a historic summit between Mr. Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un.
Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue ahead of this much-anticipated meeting. U.S. and North Korean officials have held working-level talks. This was this morning in Singapore.
And we'll bring you the latest market action here in Asia as the South Korean markets start trading today. A reminder of our top story this afternoon. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un will make history tomorrow when they become the first sitting leaders of the U.S. and North Korea to meet in person.
On the agenda, addressing North Korea's nuclear weapons program and much more, with the hope of achieving peace on the Korean peninsula. Our Washington correspondent Harry Horton looks ahead to this summit.
In just a few months, the war of words has been cast aside.
They will be met with fire and fury.
for flattery and diplomacy to take centre stage.
Kim Jong-Un he really has been very open and I think very honorable.
In a quest to succeed where his predecessors failed, President Trump has bet that by meeting with Kim Jong-un, he can strike up a relationship that could lead to denuclearization. But it won't be easy. Kim has gone from an international pariah to a world leader in diplomatic overdrive.
I think he has proved more savvy on the international stage than perhaps people anticipated. And in that sense, I think from the perspective of American negotiators, you need to actually take the North Koreans very seriously.
The US says Kim Jong-un is willing to denuclearize. The problem is agreeing on what that means and how quickly it should happen.
Unless we see very, very concrete, verifiable steps where inspectors can go in, where things are dismantled, unless we see some of that, we're probably looking at yet another case of North Korea getting a timeout and getting a pass.
In recent weeks, President Trump has played down expectations and says the summit will be the start of a process. But he has dangled the possibility of a peace deal between North and South Korea, formally ending an almost 70-year conflict.
We could sign an agreement, as you know, that would be a first step. It's what happens after the agreement that really is the big point.
Not everyone thinks that's the right approach.
If you offer that right up front, you remove your ability to continue to put pressure on the North Koreans in some way to move forward on denuclearization, because you're not really holding anything out there still to incentivize them.
Without doubt, this is Donald Trump's biggest gamble as president so far. He's determined to solve this crisis, and he's unlikely to get another opportunity like this again.
If this doesn't work, and if the president needs to keep pressure on, and indeed increase pressure, he's going to find it hard, because he's raised expectations so much. It's going to be very difficult to get anyone other than the Japanese, basically, and perhaps European allies, to pressure North Korea. The Chinese aren't going to want to go back there. The South Koreans aren't going to want to go back there. And there's no reason why they should, because the United States is not going to credibly be able to say, well, that didn't work, we're going to use a military strike now. I think that's off the table.
The meeting will be historic, but with such a mercurial duo, few people can predict much more than that. Harry Horton, Channel News Asia, Washington.
Well, for more insights on the Trump-Kim summit, we have with us in studio Mr. John Delury. He's an associate professor at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies based in Seoul. But you're in Singapore, of course, for these historic few days. Let's start off by talking about one of the unpredictable leaders. We could say both are, but Mr. Trump, you know, he has said in the lead up to this, when he looks at Mr. Kim Jong-un in the eye, within 60 seconds, he will be able to assess whether or not he is serious about peace. What do you make of that? Is that just rhetoric? Is this Mr. Trump's approach and his approach all this while in terms of dealing with North Korea?
Well, it's hard to separate rhetoric, you know, from reality. And Donald Trump brings a very different language to traditional diplomacy. He's a disruptive force. So when he said, I'll know in 5 seconds, or you can read a person in 5 seconds, that is not a traditional diplomatic concept, to be sure. I don't know. You know, there's a degree to which I think, strangely, Donald Trump may be right. Not in the literal sense of he'll only need a minute. But I do think that he's going to get a read. He's going to take the measure of Kim Jong-un tomorrow, whenever they meet here in Singapore. And he's going to make a basic assessment. Is this a leader I can work with? Is this guy serious? Or is this whole thing, as some people think, as some experts think, is this all a ruse? You know, is this all just another North Korean deception? I do think that President Trump's going to make a decision relatively quickly, and we can question whether he has the capability to make that decision, but I think any leader would make that. If it were Barack Obama now, he would have made that determination. And actually, this does go to a strength of this approach, which is you get in the room, and you get one-on-one or with your small groups, and you can get a read on Kim Jong-un, and you can't do that at a distance. You can't, I assure you, I read North Korean, news and try to go through their state media to squeeze some lemonade out of the lemons, but you can't get a read unless you meet face to face, so I think it is actually the right way to start this process.
Dr. Delury, it's easy to say it's right in retrospect, but in your case, early last year, February 2017, you wrote an article in which presciently you said direct negotiations are the only way to find out what happens. And secondly, a point you made, which few others have made up to this point, is that Trump and Kim may be an unlikely pair, but they are well positioned to strike the kind of deal that would lower the risk that we worry about.
Yeah, it's always nice for a professor to be read, so thank you for that. But part of my reasoning behind why I thought Donald Trump was capable of this is because, frankly, in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, traditional liberals and conservatives, have gotten stuck in a real rut. And that's why North Korea, that's why it's been so frustrating to policymakers. So it was terribly frustrating to the Obama administration and also to the George W. Bush administration. So this is one area where Donald Trump, because he doesn't feel the pressures of a traditional conservative or liberal, he's able to do exactly what we're seeing now, to sort of ignore all the criticism and just charge straight ahead and say, I want to talk to this guy. Let's talk first, build a relationship, and then the negotiation is going to proceed from that. And I think that is, having had some dealings with North Korea, I've visited 4 times, I've, participated in some of these so-called track 2 discussions, I've experienced the virtue of that approach in dealing with this North Korea problem. And so that's why a year ago, I imagined the scenario we're in now.
Your scenario was eventually, in order to get North Korea to stop developing missiles and nuclear weapons, it needs to feel secure. And the idea is that this face-to-face negotiation might create that break the deadlock in terms of, look, let me talk to you about it, and let's get started on detail. The argument now is there's too much detail we haven't sorted out going into the summit. However, unless you have this summit, you won't even get a chance to touch this detail. Where are you on that argument?
Yeah, well, that's a great way of framing it. And I would say, as haphazard as some of this process has been so far, if we take a step back and look at it, because Donald Trump said, I want to meet him, because he grabbed that meeting and said, get me that meeting, what that allowed was the 2 teams, the American team and the North Korean team, of highly skilled and seasoned diplomats. I mean, I've interacted with some of these North Koreans in an unofficial capacity and know some of the Americans by reputation. These are serious people. They know the issues they're dealing with. They are having these intensive deliberations. Even they're going on still right now. Those deliberations are going to continue after whatever we see between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And so because the 2 big leaders said, we want this relationship, it's authorized all the sort of working level folks, still at a high level, but the working level people to say, okay, how are we going to change our relationship? What can you do? What do you want us to do? What's the timeline? That process has already begun. We're going to see how far they got in the next 2 days. But that process is, I think, likely to continue. And that is the core process. It's changing the relationship, changing the perceptions, the threat perceptions on both sides. That's how we can sort of break the logjam of dealing with North Korea.
Now, what makes this summit partly so intriguing is the fact that North Korea is stepping out, and we are seeing Mr. Kim Jong-un in a capacity that no one has seen him in before. So little is known about him. We don't even know his exact age. So take us into the North Korean psyche. Some analysts are saying the very fact that Kim Jong-un and Mr. Trump are within a 10-minute walking distance of each other, that is a win in the North Korean column. So what do you think North Korea can expect from these summits, given the fact that there's a meeting set up with the President of the United States?
Well, there's a lot of important points embedded in that question. For one thing, I would say, to us, as you said, Kim Jong-un is mysterious. He's not mysterious to North Koreans. That you could say that's a flaw in their system. They hear about Kim Jong-un all the time. They see his picture all the time. He physically visits a lot of places around the country and interacts. You think about it. Actually, North Korea is a small country, 25 million. A lot of people have seen Kim Jong-un or know someone who's seen Kim Jong-un at this point. So He's been very active in his 6 years. North Koreans have seen a lot about him. They know a lot about him. What we're now seeing in the last 6 months is not a discontinuity. It's actually a continuity. Now Kim Jong-un's coming out into the world. And he's comfortable coming to a place like Singapore. I mean, this is my first visit to Singapore, too. And I'm quite struck in my first impressions of what a good place this is, you know, of a orderly, a safe, a welcoming, a city with a very mixed, and country with a very mixed heritage that has brought a lot of people together, you know, and learned to coexist. I mean, it's kind of a model of peaceful coexistence. And so Kim Jong-un feels comfortable coming way out of North Korean comfort zone to hold this spectacular meeting with Donald Trump, with all the press running around. So that shows us, in my view, that Kim Jong-un has been for 6 years preparing his country, consolidating power. Some of those things have been very brutal, and that's why we think of him in very bad moral terms, the things he's done to get that hold on power. The positive side is, I believe he's been preparing his country to do what he's doing, to sort of come out into the world and to have non-hostile relationships, even with the United States. And of course, this process is going on with South Korea, even more dramatically than what we're seeing with the United States. So I think Kim Jong-un has already made a strategic decision about changing the nature of North Korea, how it relates to the neighborhood, how it fits into the world.
So in terms of objectives for this summit, what would you say Mr. Kim is looking for?
I think he wants to get off on the right foot with Donald Trump. I think, you know, you don't have to be a nuclear physicist to see certain things about the Donald Trump style of diplomacy, of politics. It's very personal relationship oriented. You know, we kind of saw that with the G7 meltdown, right? It became about Donald and Justin. North Koreans are smart. They can read, you know, the tea leaves on the American side. And so I would anticipate that Kim Jong-un is here to have a very positive interaction, to establish that level of confidence, not trust, but confidence with Donald Trump, that we can work with one another. I think that Kim Jong-un, if he acts the way he's acted with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, with Chinese President Xi Jinping, if you watch the footage of them, we don't know what they're saying, but you notice Kim Jong-un is listening. He listens a lot. So I think Kim Jong-un will listen to Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump will listen to Kim Jong-un. I think, or I should say, this is a best case scenario. It's not about give me your nukes by September. It's going to be about open-ended questions, probing, starting to figure out on the two sides, who are we dealing with and how can we move forward? And so I think for Kim Jong-un, that's the win. I think we overestimate the propaganda coup of getting to meet the American president. North Korea has been around for 70 years and legitimized itself without ever getting a meeting with an American president. So this is not the key to the North Korean system.
So, John, very quickly, barring a massive meltdown, we're looking almost at 100% success because there will be a deal. They're both predisposed to shaking hands and saying nice things.
Well, yeah. Quickly.
Yeah, very quickly.
I mean, that's what a good summit's supposed to be. You know, a good summit is not supposed to be about surprises. It's supposed to be about setting expectations going in, and the two come out and say, we had a good summit, and now it's off to the next.
Okay, all right. When we return, I'm going to look far beyond a nice photo op. Thanks for that, John. John Delury was staying with us. He's associate professor at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. Stay with us. We take a short break.
headlines, U.S. President Donald Trump and Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong have met at the Istana, a day ahead of a historic summit between Mr. Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un.
Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue ahead of the much-anticipated meeting. U.S. and North Korean officials held working-level talks this morning in Singapore.
And we're bringing you the latest trading action here in Asia as markets are up and running.
Right, let's check in on how the sentiment is shaping up in South Korea. With the stock market, in fact, about 6 minutes or thereabout to close for the trading session. And broadly speaking, the sentiment has been emboldened throughout the day. The market started off with fractional gains in the early morning trading session, and then gains have accelerated, even though the summit, of course, hasn't happened between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. That does happen tomorrow. Investors are keeping a very close eye, of course, on the events over the next 2 days and the outcome of the G7, which wasn't so favorable. If you take a look at the Kospi index, it's almost going to shut for the day, and at the day's high, up about 0.6%. So sentiment certainly is getting brighter. And actually, we saw this during the Inter-Korean summit as well, on the 27th of April, pre and post that. Now, here's the benchmark index so far and how it's fared throughout the year. As you can see, the Kospi reached a record high on January the 29th, settling at just under 2,600 points. Now, by the time of the first Inter-Korean summit later on this year, the Kospi was trading slightly lower from those previous highs that we saw back in January. But on the day of the Inter-Korean summit, the Kospi was trading at 2,492, and then it continued to rise throughout that week and peaked at around 2,515 points by April the 30th. So, from pre-summit to post-summit, the Kospi responded very well, rising 2.7%. Now, as symbolic as these summits are, they can go a long way in improving investor sentiment, and it remains to be seen what outcomes we get from tomorrow's talks, but investors will surely be watching very closely. Well, moving on, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad says growing nations like his country need different trade protections, and that trade pact, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TPP, must be renegotiated. Now, Dr. Mahathir made the comments during his official visit to Japan, his first trip abroad after becoming Malaysia's 7th Prime Minister last month. Well, let's cross over now to our Malaysian correspondent, Melissa Goh. She is at the Nikkei conference in Tokyo, where Dr. Mahathir delivered his address. And Mel, Dr. Mahathir just delivered that address on keeping Asia open and talked about starting another national car project. I mean, just last year, Najib Razak sold Proton back in June for a mere 150 million Singapore dollars, and he said that this project was not sustainable. Why would Dr. Mahathir want to start a national car project again?
Well, that's really anyone's guess. Now, he's still sore about that deal. Now, this is Dr. Mahathir's first overseas visit after he was sworn in as the country's 7th Prime Minister about a month ago. When he was first-time Prime Minister in the 80s, remember the national car maker Proton was his pet project, his brainchild. He was inspired by Japan, their work ethics and so on. Now, he set up Proton in the 80s with technical assistance from Mitsubishi Motors, but he became loss-making in the end, and the car maker had to be bailed out several times by the government, and last year it was sold to China, Zhejiang's Geely. Now, Geely wanted to use Proton as a platform to penetrate the Southeast Asian market that's dominated by Japanese cars. And Dr. Mahathir also revealed that Geely has limited Proton to producing right-hand drive cars and restricting the companies from selling its cars in China. So he's now toying the idea of starting a new national car company in Malaysia with the help of South Asian partners, one that produces cars that comply with Euro 5 or Euro 6 emission standards so that they can penetrate a bigger market, one that uses sensors, embracing the latest technology and so on. But many back home are asking, is this the right time to pursue it, given that the country is saddled with huge debts of about 1 trillion ringgit? That's about 80% of the country's GDP, and he announced that. Now, Dr. Mahathir is 93 years old. He's a man in a hurry, and he has said that he intended to hand over to his former nemesis, now turned partner, Arno Ibrahim, for him in 1-2 years' time. But now he's telling people in the conference that he will stay on as long as the people want him to. Let's listen to what he has to say.
I was one who started this so-called national car. Well, a national car must be owned by Malaysians. At the very beginning, we had a small investment from Japan, Mitsubishi Motors Corporation and Mitsubishi Corporation. But now, eventually, we were able to manage on our own. But now the company has been sold to the Chinese company. It is no longer a national car. Our ambition is to start another national car, perhaps with some help from our partners in Southeast Asia.
Well, Mel, Trump-Kim summit also took center stage at the discussions. What did Dr. Mahathir have to say about that?
Well, indeed, the Trump-Kim summit is much focused at this Nikkei conference as well. Earlier, Dr. Mahathir was asked about his opinion, his comments about the summit, both here at the Nikkei conference and also later on at the Japan National Press Club. He said that the change in attitude of the North Korean leader should be welcomed, and global community, he said, must make full use of this change in attitude, this new attitude, and not be so cynical about it, although many doubt whether Kim Jong-un's efforts is genuine or not. Now, it's seen as too radical a change, he said. North Korea has been belligerent all these while, he said, but he said he welcomed, nevertheless, this new development. It's important to understand. But on President Trump of the United States, meanwhile, Dr. Mahathir said Malaysia is still trying to guess, trying to understand the U.S. leader, which is so unpredictable, he said. But Malaysia welcomes all countries as friends, including U.S., China. They want to do business with everyone, regardless of their ideology. Trade has been his main focus here, and Dr. Mahathir was articulating the country's foreign policy as well, because this is his first overseas visit since he was sworn in as the country's prime minister about a month ago, and he has yet to fill his cabinet fully, and there isn't a foreign minister in Malaysia yet.
All right, Mel, thank you very much for getting us the updates there. Mel Go in Tokyo at the Nikkei conference. Well, on that note, that's going to conclude your business updates. We're going to take it back to Wei-Su and Teresa. Back to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Adam. Well, lunch is wrapping up at the Istana, and along with ice cream for dessert, U.S. President Donald Trump was presented with an early birthday cake. Take a look at this. Now, Mr. Trump's birthday is actually
14th
of June. So Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Singapore, posted this on his Facebook page a short time ago. And Mr. Trump looking rather pleased.
Yeah, celebrating birthday a bit early. I can't see what that cake is.
I'm not sure either, but a nice way to end that working lunch.
Supposed to like chocolate brownies, so we were told by Simon. All right. Speaking of Simon, we're standing by outside the Istana is Simon Marks, who has been monitoring developments on Mr. Trump's bilateral meeting with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. Simon, we return to an earlier point.
Yes, absolutely, we're waiting now, of course, for the delegation to leave.
You mentioned earlier, or we mentioned earlier, and we did ask you, but if you could clarify for us, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeting substantive and detailed meetings in Singapore today as Ambassador Kim meets with the DPRK. What else do we know about the working level talks between officials from both sides that happened earlier this morning at the Ritz-Carlton?
Well, I think it's fair to say that they've got quite a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross. I should just say we're beginning to see, as I'm sure you can see, motorcycle outriders now preparing to leave the Astana. That's the first indication that it won't be long before we see Donald Trump's motorcade leave the building and head back to the Shangri-La Hotel, where he is staying as he waits for his summit meeting with Kim Jong-Un. Certainly, Mike Pompeo's tweets indicate a couple of things. One, that there is still quite a lot of work to be done behind the scenes scenes, preparing in full the agenda for this summit meeting so that the staffs, both North Korean and American, can inform the leaders as to what may be on the agenda and what they may be able to agree upon or disagree about when they get together on Sentosa. We also saw Mike Pompeo tweeting earlier in the day that the American focus is very much on the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That seemed to be the Secretary of State staking out America's position that much as the North Koreans may want to minimize the conversation about denuclearization during the course of tomorrow's summit, it is uppermost in the minds certainly of the Secretary of State and of other national security and foreign policy advisors within the Trump administration. Now, at the end of the day, it's going to fall to President Trump really to focus that conversation when he walks into the room and meets Kim Jong-un for that historic first face-to-face meeting. We've learned from a National Security Council spokesman in the last few minutes that they will indeed begin the meeting with a one-on-one session with only interpreters present. There will be no other aides and advisors in the room. That certainly gives the two men an opportunity to take the measure of one another and to try to begin establishing a personal relationship. Remember that Donald Trump has said he will know within the first minute of meeting Kim Jong-un whether Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans are indeed serious about advancing the cause of peace on the Korean Peninsula. But there's also a danger in a one-on-one meeting, certainly as far as Donald Trump is concerned, that he may find himself agreeing to things that his national security team don't want him to agree to. There's an opportunity as well, though. The man who wrote The Art of the Deal wrote the book on deal-making, getting a first chance without his aides and staff to sit down and try and establish at least the contours of the broader conversation that we expect will later follow.
Now, for our viewers just joining us now, you are looking at live pictures of the entrance to the Istana, which is the official residence and office of the President of Singapore, which is where Mr. Trump has met with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. The convoy is now leaving the Istana, headed back west about 5 kilometers to the Shangri-La Hotel, where Mr. Trump is staying for the duration of his visit.
I think that would be either of those cars with the flags would contain Mr. Trump. Now, he apparently had a fairly good meeting at the Istana, where he had an early birthday cake given to him, and it was tweeted by Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, Singapore's Foreign Affairs Minister. Mr. Trump is headed back to the Shangri-La Hotel, where, of course, the U.S. entourage is staying, and we are told at about 2:20 he will have a meet and greet with the U.S. Embassy. No clear indication of venue, but we presume that given that he has only 5 minutes between arriving and 2:20, he will be at the Shangri-La Hotel.
And spectators again lining the streets as President Trump and his motorcade make their way back to the Shangri-La Hotel. And what is different between Mr. Trump's entourage and Mr. Kim's is Mr. Kim's vehicle was completely blacked out. You could not see inside who was contained in the vehicle, but you could see Mr. Trump waving to some of the onlookers on the streets of Singapore. Now let's bring in Simon Marks again. Simon, so we do know Mr. Trump still has a meeting with the U.S. Embassy in Singapore this afternoon. But as for the official itinerary for this evening, the public isn't really aware as to what he's up to. What do you know about the rest of today as well as the hours leading up to the summit tomorrow?
No, it's completely open on his schedule. You make a very good point there, Teresa, about the cars. I was lucky enough now to see both motorcades. Kim Jong-un's yesterday, which drove past me, and now Donald Trump's, which has just driven past me. And you literally couldn't see whether there was actually anybody in the back of Kim Jong-un's car yesterday. Whereas here, we've seen Donald Trump wave at us as he drove into the Astana, and we've seen his hand waving in the back of the car as he drove out. He heads back to the Shangri-La for what's described as a meet and greet with U.S. diplomats and embassy staff here. That's fairly normal protocol for any president of the United States when they travel overseas. They want to see American diplomats and thank them for all the hard work that they've done, not just setting up this summit, but also, of course, more broadly in terms of their daily work here in Singapore. But then the rest of the day is completely open. And I think one of the questions we're going to be asking is Will he be hitting Twitter again? And if he does, will he be tweeting again about his unhappiness with what went on at the G7 summit? Or is he going to turn his attention much more rapidly to the conversation that he'll be having tomorrow morning with Kim Jong-Un? I suspect we also shouldn't rule out the possibility of something unexpected happening. Knowing Donald Trump from covering him back in Washington on a daily basis, I can tell you that he doesn't particularly like being holed up anywhere, and he gets somewhat irritable when he's stuck behind the closed doors of a hotel. So we'll see how he puts up with that this afternoon.
Oh, thanks. Speaking of hold up, Simon, we are looking at pictures now.